The voice on the monitor wasn't mine, and it wasn't Lily's. It was Daniel's, low and satisfied, floating through the static like something that had been rehearsed. "She left. It worked," he said. Then, quieter, like a man tasting a secret he'd been saving, "Once she signs the transfer, the house is ours." I sat there in my dress uniform in the dark of my own laundry room, and I did not move. Not because I was frozen, because for the first time in 11 months, I finally understood exactly what I was dealing with. But I need to back up because none of this makes sense unless you understand how ordinary the evening started. I'd been at the base since 6 that morning, running logistics for a battalion that was supposed to deploy in 11 weeks, and currently had half its transport manifests in the wrong format. By the time I got home, my feet ached inside my boots and my uniform smelled like the motor pool. I remember thinking on the drive back that I wanted exactly 3 things: to see Lily's face light up when I walked in to eat something that wasn't from a vending machine, and to sleep for 8 hours without my phone buzzing. I got none of those things, not right away. Daniel was in the kitchen when I came through the door, phone pressed to his ear, and the second he saw me, his whole posture changed. He didn't say goodbye to whoever he was talking to. He just hung up, smooth as anything, like he'd practiced that motion 100 times in front of a mirror. "Who was that?" I asked, setting my bag down. "Work," he said. "Nothing important. I've spent 20 years learning to read people who are trying not to be read. Soldiers under stress. Contractors hiding cost overruns. Officers who don't want to admit they missed a deadline." Daniel's voice had that same flatness, that same overcorrection, and I felt something small and cold settle in my stomach. I didn't chase it. I was tired, and I told myself I was imagining things, and I went to find Lily instead. She was on the couch in the living room, half asleep already, the old baby monitor sitting on the side table where it had lived since she was 2. A leftover habit from when she used to wake up screaming and we never got around to putting it away. She still had nightmares sometimes, still needed to hear my voice through that little speaker some nights when I was away. I kissed her forehead, and she murmured something about a math test and rolled over. Then Daniel found me in the hallway with an envelope. "I need you to look at this before Thursday," he said, holding it out. "It's just some restructuring paperwork. For the mortgage, the savings account, a few things Vanessa's group put together to help us consolidate." "Vanessa," I repeated. "She's in finance, I've mentioned her." He had, actually, a handful of times over the past few weeks, always in that same casual tone, the way you'd mention a coworker who covers your shift or splits a lunch bill with you. I opened the envelope anyway because that's who I am. I don't sign anything without reading it. Not a deployment order, not a supply contract, not a marriage's worth of paperwork. The language was dense, full of terms I wanted to sit with. Transfer of beneficiary, refinancing authorization, power of attorney limited. "I want to read through this properly," I told him. "Not tonight." That's when his face did something I hadn't seen before. Something tight around the eyes. "You can command soldiers, Stephanie," he said, "but you don't understand civilian money. I've been shot at in a supply convoy outside Bagram. I've briefed generals who didn't want to hear what I had to say. I've buried friends and signed the paperwork after. None of that prepared me for how much that one sentence hurt, delivered in my own kitchen by the man I'd built a life with. Not because it was true, because of how easily it came out of him, like he'd said it before, maybe not to me, maybe just in his head, rehearsing the exact moment he'd finally say it out loud. I felt the heat rise in my chest, the kind I usually reserve for briefings gone wrong, and I knew if I stayed in that kitchen another minute, I'd say something I couldn't take back. "I need air," I said. "Don't follow me." I grabbed my keys off the hook and walked out, and I heard the door slam behind me harder than I meant it to. I drove 3 loops around the neighborhood, past the Henderson's Halloween lights already up in July, past the elementary school where Lily would start 3rd grade in the fall, and somewhere on the second loop, the anger cooled into something sharper. Something that sounded a lot like instinct. 20 years in uniform teaches you that when something feels wrong, you don't walk away from it. You get closer quietly and you watch. So instead of driving until I felt better, I turned back. I pulled into the garage instead of the driveway the way I do when I don't want the motion light announcing me, and I let myself in through the laundry room. I didn't call out. I didn't turn on the light. I just sat down on the folding table bench in my dress uniform, and I picked up the receiver end of Lily's old baby monitor, the one still sitting on the living room side table, still transmitting. I don't know exactly what I expected to hear. Maybe nothing. Maybe just Daniel muttering to himself the way people do when they think no one's listening. What I heard instead was his voice, low and pleased, talking to someone who wasn't me. "She left. It worked." A pause. "Then, once she signs the transfer, the house is ours." My hands went still on the receiver. A woman's voice answered him, faint but audible. "And what about the child?" And Daniel, without a single second of hesitation, said the words that changed everything. I already know how to take Lily from her. I want to tell you that I saw it coming from the beginning. I didn't. If I'm honest with you, and I promised myself I would be all the way through this, I missed it for weeks because I wanted to miss it. Because believing your marriage is fine takes so much less energy than admitting it isn't. 3 weeks before that night in the laundry room, I came home from a 10-day field training exercise covered in dust that had gotten into places dust shouldn't go, and Lily ran out the front door before I'd even gotten my bag out of the trunk. She hit me at full speed, arms around my waist, and for a second everything in the world was exactly right. Daniel stood in the doorway and watched us with his arms crossed. "Nice of the army to return my wife," he said. I laughed it off. That's what you do early on with a comment like that. You laugh, you let it roll past you, because the alternative is starting a fight in your own driveway with your daughter still hanging off your neck. I told myself he was just tired of holding down the house alone. I told myself a lot of things that month. But the small stuff kept adding up. I noticed the banking app on my phone had logged me out, and when I tried to log back in, my password didn't work. Daniel said he'd updated the security settings and would send me the new one. He never did, not that week, not the next. I started noticing that the mail came in, and by the time I got to it in the evening, certain envelopes were already open bank statements, mostly the ones with the little glassine windows. When I asked him about it, he said he liked to stay on top of the bills, so I didn't have to worry since I already had enough on my plate at the base. There was a folder of mortgage documents that used to live in the filing cabinet in the office. One evening I went looking for our refinancing paperwork from 2 years back just to check an interest rate figure for a conversation with a neighbor, and the folder wasn't there. Daniel said he'd moved it to his car for a meeting. I didn't ask which meeting. I should have. And then there was Vanessa, who kept appearing in his sentences the way certain names do when someone wants you to get used to hearing them. Vanessa thinks the market's going to shift. Vanessa's handling the group's investment side. Vanessa said something funny at lunch today. Always professional, always just enough context to sound harmless, and never quite enough for me to picture her as a real person. At dinner one night, Daniel brought up my next set of orders, an overseas rotation still months away, not even confirmed, and turned it into something else entirely. "It's just interesting," he said, cutting his chicken with more precision than necessary. "How Lily's whole life has to bend around your schedule, not the other way around." "I don't choose my orders, Daniel." "No," he agreed too easily. "You don't, but somebody has to be the one who's actually here." I sat with that sentence longer than I wanted to. Lily was across the table eating her rice one grain at a time, the way she does when the adults are using the wrong voices, and I smiled at her so she wouldn't feel the temperature in the room. Later, once she was asleep, I told myself Daniel was just stressed. Work had been hard on him too, hadn't it? I decided not to push. That's the part that still sits heavy with me. Not that he was building something against me, but that some part of me clocked it and chose comfort over confrontation. I mentioned some of it to Natalie over coffee that week, mostly the banking password thing, framed as an annoyance rather than what it actually was. Natalie's been my closest friend since our second deployment together, and she has the kind of mind that doesn't let details go soft around the edges. She listened to the whole list, the mail, the missing folder, the comments about my absences without interrupting, and when I finished, she didn't tell me I was overreacting. "He isn't just angry," she said. "He's building a narrative." I remember laughing a little too fast. "A narrative for what?" She didn't answer that directly. She just said, "Keep your eyes open, Steph. Write things down if you can. Date specifics. Not because I think something's about to happen, because if it does, you'll wish you had them." I didn't write anything down that week. I wish I could tell you I did. What I did instead was go home, kiss my daughter goodnight, and try to be a better wife, softer, less defensive, the kind of person Daniel seemed to want more of. I let the mortgage folder go. I let the banking password go. I told myself I was choosing my marriage over my suspicion, and that felt at the time like the mature thing to do. It was 2 nights later that I found it, not looking for anything, just searching through Daniel's leather document case for a stamp, because Lily needed one for a school permission slip, and I was already running late. Underneath a stack of insurance papers was a photocopy of my most recent leave and earnings statement, my military pay stub, with my full social security number visible at the top. Clipped to it was a loan application, mostly blank, but with my name already typed into the borrower field. I stood there in the office with the permission slip still in my other hand, and for the first time, the cold feeling in my stomach didn't go away when I told myself I was imagining things, because I wasn't imagining anything at all. Lily's school held its fall fundraiser on a Friday evening string. Lights hung between the oak trees in the courtyard, parent volunteers selling raffle tickets for a spa basket. Nobody really wanted, but everybody bid on anyway. I'd promised Lily I'd be there in something other than my uniform, so I'd changed into a navy dress in the car, and I remember feeling almost normal walking in with Daniel's hand at the small of my back, like we were still the couple other parents waved at across the room. That lasted about 10 minutes. Daniel spotted someone near the drinks table and steered us both toward her before I'd even registered who she was. "Steph, this is Vanessa Cole. We work together." She was exactly what I expected, and somehow also not tall, composed, the kind of smile that reaches exactly as far as it needs to, and no further. She shook my hand a beat too long and said, "I've heard so much about you," in a tone that suggested she meant it literally. "All good things, I hope." I said the reflexive thing you say. "Fascinating things," she corrected, and there was something underneath it I couldn't name yet. Over the next 20 minutes, standing near the silent auction table with a plastic cup of lukewarm punch, Vanessa mentioned my upcoming training rotation dates I hadn't even given Daniel in writing. She asked almost offhand whether the bonus from my last assignment had cleared yet. She referenced gently that Lily had seen a school counselor last spring, something Daniel and I had discussed privately and never brought up outside our own kitchen. I looked at Daniel. How does she know all that? He didn't miss a beat. "We work together, Steph. People talk. But people don't talk about social security details of my daughter's therapy schedule over office small talk. I know what casual knowledge sounds like, and I know what studied knowledge sounds like. And Vanessa had the second kind. I watched them together for the rest of the evening in the specific way you watch two people who've decided you're not really watching." She touched his wrist when she laughed at something he said. He laughed more easily around her than he had at our own dinner table in weeks. There were little references between them, a joke about a conference in Charlotte, a nickname I'd never heard him use, the small currency of people who've spent time together that a spouse wasn't present for. At one point, Vanessa caught me watching and held my gaze for just a second too long. Not guilty, not even embarrassed. Something closer to satisfaction, like a hand being shown at the end of a long game. Lily found us near the dessert table, sticky-fingered from a cupcake, and tugged on Daniel's sleeve. "Why did that lady call Dad Danny? Nobody calls Daniel Danny. Not his mother, not his oldest friends." I felt the question land somewhere between us like a dropped glass. "Just a work thing," Daniel said too quickly and steered Lily toward the raffle table before I could ask anything else. I tried to bring it up in the car on the way home carefully, the way you approach a subject you already suspect will detonate. "How long has Vanessa worked with you?" "A year, maybe. Why does it matter?" She knew about my bonus. She knew about Lily's counselor. "I don't control what people remember from conversations," he said, eyes on the road, jaw tight. "Are you seriously doing this tonight?" I let it go. Not because I believed him, because Lily was in the back seat half asleep against her booster seat straps, and I didn't want her waking to raised voices in a moving car. That night, after Lily had gone down and woken once from a bad dream, I sat beside her bed with the monitor on the nightstand, more out of habit than necessity now that she was 8, and I thought about the way Vanessa had looked at me across that courtyard. Not like a stranger, like someone measuring an opponent. The next morning before work, I logged into my credit monitoring app, something Natalie had drilled into me years ago, back when a soldier in her unit had his identity stolen mid-deployment. There was a new inquiry I hadn't authorized. A hard pull dated 4 days earlier from a lender I didn't recognize. I called Natalie from the base parking lot before my shift started. "Don't confront him yet," she said, once I'd gotten through the fundraiser, the credit alert, all of it. "Lock your credit today, not tomorrow today. Start writing down dates, screenshots, anything with a timestamp. And Stephanie, protect your military paperwork specifically. Your LES, your ID, your signature. If someone's building a case that you're unstable or absent, your service record is either your best evidence or your biggest liability, depending on who gets to it first." I did exactly what she said. I locked my credit before lunch. I photographed the loan application I'd found in Daniel's case, careful to replace it exactly as it had been. I started a note on my phone, time-stamped, factual, stripped of any emotion I could manage to strip from it. That evening, an email arrived on the shared account we used for the kids' savings account, a routine notification, the kind you'd normally delete without reading. "Beneficiary designation updated," it said. I opened it out of habit more than suspicion. The new beneficiary listed on our joint savings account was Vanessa Cole. So that's where I was standing when the story caught up to itself, back in the laundry room in my dress uniform, holding the monitor receiver against my ear like it might disappear if I let go. I told you the beginning. Now I'll tell you the rest of what I heard that night because it took nearly 20 minutes, and every one of those minutes rearranged something in me. Daniel wasn't just having an affair. That would have been simple in a terrible way, a wound I already knew how to survive. What came through that little speaker was something else entirely, a plan fully built with dates and steps and contingencies, the kind of thing you don't improvise in the heat of guilt. You construct it slowly, the way I'd build a logistics timeline for a deployment. Except this timeline was built to dismantle me. Vanessa's voice tight with nerves. What if she finds out? Daniel, easy, almost bored. She follows rules. That's her weakness. I sat very still when he said that. 20 years of discipline had taught me exactly how to do that, how to hold a posture, keep my breathing even, let a blow land without letting my face show it landed. I let it land. And underneath the sting, something else started moving. Something colder and more useful than anger. They went through it piece by piece, like people reviewing a contract before signing. Daniel described a file he'd been compiling, texts he planned to frame out of context, a log of every night I'd worked late or traveled for training, a narrative he intended to hand to a family law attorney describing me as erratic, absent, not built for a stable home. He said if I got angry enough, if he could provoke a reaction on record, it would help the story he wanted to tell a judge. He talked about the loan applications, plural, drawn against my name and my security clearance income. He talked about a shell company Vanessa's family had used before, a clean way to move the house without my name attached to the sale. And he talked casually, the way you'd mention picking up dry cleaning, about filing for temporary custody of Lily, the moment my next set of orders came through while I was out of the country and couldn't contest it in person. She won't even see it coming, he said. I thought about all the nights I'd sat beside Lily's bed with this same monitor, listening for her breathing to steady after a nightmare. I thought about how Daniel was using that same device, the small mechanical proof of how much I loved my daughter, completely unaware that it would be the thing that undid him. I didn't go downstairs. Everything in me wanted to. Every instinct that had ever served me in a crisis was screaming to walk into that room and put a stop to it with my own 2 hands. But I've commanded soldiers long enough to know that the moment you react is the moment you lose control of the situation. And Daniel had all but told Vanessa that provoking me was part of his plan. I wasn't going to hand him that. Instead, I took out my phone. I hit record on the monitor app that mirrored to it something I'd set up months earlier, just to catch Lily's night terrors on file for her pediatrician, never imagining what else it might catch. I photographed the time on my screen. I texted Natalie 4 words, "Come get me, now." Then I sat there another 8 minutes recording, memorizing details, until I heard their voices move toward the front hallway, and the sound of Vanessa's car pulling out of the driveway. I left the way I'd come in, quietly through the garage, my heels in one hand so they wouldn't sound against the concrete. I drove to Natalie's with the windows down, cold air on my face, because I needed to feel something besides the ringing in my ears. Natalie met me at her door, already dressed like she'd known this call was coming for weeks. We sat at her kitchen table and played the recording twice. The second time she stopped it halfway through and reached for a folder on the counter, documents I hadn't known. She'd already started pulling copies of financial disclosures from my own accounts, cross-referenced against dates Daniel had claimed he was traveling for work. She laid 1 page flat on the table between us. A loan document. My signature at the bottom, except it wasn't. The loop on the S leaned the wrong direction. Something I'd never once written in 20 years of signing paperwork. Under fire, under deadline, under every kind of pressure imaginable. "Stephanie," she said, and something in her voice made me look up. He didn't just forge a loan application. She set the page down like it was evidence in a courtroom, because it was. "He forged your military signature." I sat with that for a long moment. Not the affair. Not the money, not even the custody plan. This, a man taking the one signature that represented every oath I'd ever sworn, every order I'd ever carried out, and copying it onto paper to steal from me. This was the part that finally fully burned the last of my hesitation away. I looked at Natalie across her kitchen table. "Tell me what to do," I said, "by the book, every step." She nodded slowly, already reaching for a legal pad. "Then let's build your case the way you'd build a mission," she said. "Quiet, documented, and airtight before he ever sees it coming." I came home the next morning at 6, showered at Natalie's, changed into a fresh uniform from the bag I keep in my car for exactly this kind of long duty day, and walked through my own front door like a woman who had nothing to hide. That's the hardest thing I've ever done in that house, harder than any deployment briefing, any casualty notification I'd had to help draft. walking into a kitchen where a man had spent the previous night describing in detail how he planned to take my daughter, and smiling at him like I hadn't heard a word of it. Daniel was already up, coffee in hand, doing his best impression of a worried husband. "You just left. No text, nothing. Where were you?" "I needed space," I said. "I'm sorry I didn't call. It won't happen again." I watched something in his shoulders relax, and I understood in that moment exactly how much of his plan depended on believing he had the upper hand. He wanted me apologetic. He wanted me small. It cost me something to give him that. But I'd learned a long time ago that the appearance of losing and the reality of losing are two very different things, and a good officer knows which one she can afford to hand over. Over the next several days, I ran what Natalie and I started calling, half-joking, the quiet campaign. I froze my credit fully, then reached out directly to our mortgage lender to flag potential fraud on the account using the documentation Natalie had already helped me assemble. I opened a new personal checking account at a different bank entirely, one Daniel had no history with and no reason to check. I moved my LES copies, my ID, my orders, and every piece of paper with my signature on it into a lockbox at the base behind a door only I had access to. I called the judge advocate's office and reported the forged military signature formally, which started its own quiet, separate process running in the background, one that had nothing to do with Daniel's timeline and everything to do with mine. I kept a log, every date, every conversation, every strange comment Daniel made, time-stamped and factual the way you'd log an incident report. Natalie reviewed it with me twice that week, cross-checking it against bank records and phone data, building something that could stand up to more than just my word against his. And through all of it, I made breakfast. I drove Lily to school. I sat across from Daniel at dinner and asked about his day. I let him hand me printouts and nodded along like I was absorbing every word when really I was memorizing which lender's letterhead he was using, which dates he referenced, which lies he was rehearsing on me before rehearsing them on someone with more authority than a wife who follows rules. It cost me. I won't pretend otherwise. There were nights I sat on the edge of the bathtub with the water running, so Lily wouldn't hear, just to let 10 minutes of grief out before I had to be steady again. Not grief for the marriage that had already ended the moment I heard his voice through that monitor. Grief for the version of myself who'd trusted him with everything, who'd handed over passwords and paperwork, and the shape of our future, without ever imagining he'd use it as a weapon. By the end of the week, Daniel's confidence had fully returned. He started talking again about moving forward, about a fresh start, about how good it would be once the paperwork was behind us. He told me almost gently that he'd arranged for us to meet a financial advisor that weekend downtown to formalize what he called our restructuring plan. "Saturday," he said. "Just sign everything and we can stop fighting about money." I already knew from the recording exactly who that advisor would turn out to be. I said yes anyway. What Daniel didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that the bank's fraud division had already been contacted, that a JAG officer was reviewing the forged signature as an open case, that Natalie had connected me through a colleague to a civilian attorney who specialized in exactly this kind of financial abuse, and that attorney had already begun preparing documents of her own. Daniel thought he was walking toward a quiet Saturday morning where a tired, apologetic wife would finally sign her name away. 2 nights before the meeting, I was in the kitchen rinsing dishes when my phone buzzed on the counter screen, lit Daniel's messages app open from earlier that day, and still logged in from when he'd let Lily use it for a game. I wasn't trying to look, but the reflection caught in the dark kitchen window in front of me clear as anything, and I read it without meaning to. "Saturday," she signs. "By Monday, everything belongs to us." I stood there with a wet plate in my hand, looking at my own reflection layered over his words, and for the first time in 11 days, I didn't feel the old ache in my chest. I felt something steadier, something close to calm. I finished the dishes. I dried my hands. And when Daniel walked into the kitchen a minute later asking what was for dinner, I just smiled at him. "Chicken," I said, like always. The meeting was set for 10 o'clock Saturday morning, on the 4th floor of a financial office downtown. The kind of building with a lobby fountain nobody looks at and elevators that play soft jazz nobody listens to. I came straight from a half-day shift at the base, which meant I arrived in my uniform, and I saw the flicker of irritation cross Daniel's face the second he spotted me in the hallway. "Did you have to wear that?" he said low, like it was an embarrassment. "I came straight from work," I said. It was true. It was also, I'll admit, exactly what I wanted him to see. Not a woman who'd lost her footing, but a woman who belonged to something larger than the room we were about to walk into. Vanessa was already seated at the conference table when we entered a folder in front of her, a man in a gray suit beside her whom Daniel introduced as the advisor. I recognized the type immediately, not a neutral third party, but someone's hired hand. I sat where I was directed and let my eyes move across the paperwork spread in front of me, a transfer of property interest, a refinancing authorization, a limited power of attorney, and beneath all of it, quietly slipped into the stack, a temporary custody arrangement concerning Lily. Daniel slid a pen toward me. Let's just get through this. I picked the pen up. I didn't sign. Before I do, I said, keeping my voice level, the same voice I use in briefings when I already know the answer to a question, but need it stated on the record. I have a few things I want clarified. Who prepared these documents? The advisor's mouth opened. Daniel spoke over him. It doesn't matter, Steph, It matters to me, I said. Why is Vanessa listed as beneficiary on our savings account? Vanessa's composure cracked just slightly at the edges. I think we should reschedule this, she said, reaching for her folder. Sit down, I said, not raising my voice, and something in my tone made her actually do it. One more question. Whose signature is on the loan applications filed against my social security number? Because it isn't mine. And why does a copy of my military LS have my rank and signature reproduced on a civilian bank form I never authorized? Daniel's jaw tightened. You're doing this here in front of people? I'm doing this, I said, because you were about to do something very similar to me in a courtroom without me in the room to answer for myself. That's when the door opened. A woman I'd only spoken to by phone until that morning stepped in. Diane Marsh, the fraud investigator from the bank's security division, along with my own attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Renata Cole, no relation to Vanessa, a detail I'd noted with something close to dark amusement when we first spoke. Natalie followed a step behind them there in her capacity as a military legal officer supporting my case, not commanding anyone in that civilian room, exactly as she'd promised by the book every step. Daniel went pale in a way I'd never seen on him before, not even during his father's funeral. Vanessa stood again this time, actually trying to leave, and the advisor in the gray suit began gathering papers with the panicked efficiency of a man realizing his fee wasn't worth what was about to happen to his afternoon. I set my phone on the table and pressed play. Daniel's voice filled the room, tinny through the small speaker, but unmistakable. Once she signs, the house is ours. Then a moment later, his voice again from a different night. She follows rules. That's her weakness. Nobody in that room said anything for a long moment. Renata was the first to speak. Per the fraud investigation opened this week, all transactions on the joint accounts are frozen pending review. The property transfer cannot proceed. The deed office has already been notified of a forgery complaint. And regarding the custody filing, she glanced at the temporary custody document still sitting untouched on the table. I'd advise you not to submit that, given what's currently under review with the Judge Advocate's office concerning a forged military signature. Daniel's hands were shaking. You set me up, he said, looking at me like I was the one who'd done something wrong. I set the pen down, the one he'd slid toward me 20 minutes earlier, still capped, still unused. No, Daniel, I said. I simply let you finish explaining your plan. Vanessa's lawyer was already on his feet, murmuring something about advising his client not to say another word. Vanessa herself looked for the first time since the fundraiser genuinely afraid not of me, but of what she'd let herself become part of. Security asked Daniel to step outside so the investigator could speak with him separately. At the door he turned back, and for a second I saw something in his face that might have been the man I married buried under everything else. You'll still lose Lily, he said, voice cracking. The army always comes first. I looked at him the way I'd look at a soldier trying one last maneuver after the battle was already decided. That, I said, is the last lie you'll ever use against me. He didn't have anything left to say to that. He walked out and the door closed behind him, and I sat back down at the table across from Renata, my hands finally steady, and asked what came next. The weeks after that meeting moved slower than I expected. I'd imagined somewhere in the back of my mind that a moment like that would feel like an ending. The door closing, the truth finally spoken out loud, and then some clean, immediate relief. It didn't work that way. It worked the way most real things do. Paperwork, phone calls, quiet mornings, where Lily still needed her lunch packed and I still needed to be at the base by 6. All of it happening underneath a slow, grinding process of consequences finally catching up to the people who'd earned them. Daniel's company suspended him within the month once the fraud investigators' findings made their way into a formal report: misuse of client financial data, unauthorized access to personnel records, conduct unbecoming of someone in his position. He wasn't fired outright, not at first. That came later after Vanessa, facing her own exposure, agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation in exchange for reduced liability. She handed over emails, drafts of the custody narrative Daniel had been building, the shell company paperwork tied to the house. I never spoke to her again after that. Office. I didn't need to. The fraudulent transactions were reversed. The house, the one Daniel had described so confidently as ours, stayed in my name through the divorce proceedings, and I kept it, at least for now, because Lily needed one thing in her life that didn't change shape overnight. Daniel's visitation started, supervised, a condition the court didn't hesitate to set once the forged signature was confirmed by 2 separate document examiners. I didn't ask for that outcome out of spite. I asked for it because a man who will forge his wife's name to steal from her isn't a man I trusted alone with our daughter. Not yet. Maybe not for a long while. I want to be honest about something because I think it matters. I never tried to turn Lily against her father. Even now when she asks to call him, I hand her the phone. Even now when she comes home from a supervised visit talking about something silly he said, I let myself smile along with her, because that love is hers, not mine to manage. What I refused and will keep refusing is letting him use that love as a lever against me ever again. At the mediation session near the end, Daniel asked to speak to me privately for a few minutes. I almost said no. Natalie, sitting beside me in the hallway, left the choice to me, and I decided I could afford 5 minutes. He looked smaller than I remembered him being, sitting across that narrow table, hands folded like a man in front of a commanding officer instead of the woman he used to make breakfast for. I was scared, he said finally, of becoming invisible beside you. Your rank, your file, the way people talked about you at that base like you were somebody. I couldn't stand feeling like the background. I sat with that for a moment before I answered. You weren't invisible, I said. You just couldn't stand that I was strong. He didn't have a response to that. I didn't need him to. Lily and I spent that fall rebuilding the parts of the house that had started to feel unfamiliar. We painted the living room a soft, warm yellow, the color she picked out at the hardware store with more confidence than I've seen her have about anything. We cleared out an entire drawer of old paperwork, bank statements, expired insurance forms, all the debris of a marriage that had gone somewhere I never expected. We planted marigolds along the front walk because Lily insisted they were the happiest flower, and I didn't have the heart to argue. We started doing something we called phone-free dinners, just the 2 of us most nights, where the only thing allowed on the table was food, and whatever nonsense story she wanted to tell me about her day. We kept going to family therapy together and separately, because healing isn't a single conversation in a mediation room, it's 100 small, ordinary Tuesdays afterward. The baby monitor stayed in a kitchen drawer for months, unplugged, tangled in its own cord. One evening, while I was digging for a pair of scissors, Lily spotted it and picked it up, turning it over in her hands like an artifact from someone else's life. Do we still need it? She asked. I looked at it for a long moment, that small plastic box that had once carried a lullaby I hummed to her as a baby, and then years later carried the exact words that ended her father's plan against us both. No, I said, not anymore. I put it away in a box in the closet, not thrown out, just retired the way you retire a uniform after your last deployment. Not because it failed you, but because it did exactly what it was supposed to do, and now it's time to let it rest. I used to think discipline meant enduring pain without complaint, staying quiet, staying steady, no matter what was breaking underneath. I don't believe that anymore. Real discipline, I've learned, is knowing exactly when to stop protecting someone who has already decided to betray you. Daniel thought my rules made me weak. In the end, those same rules were the reason he never took my daughter, my home, or my future. He mistook my calm for surrender. It was never that. It was just patience, waiting for the truth to finish speaking for itself. If you've made it this far with me, thank you for staying. I'd love to know, have you ever had to stay calm while someone expected you to break? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and let me know what you would have done in my place. There are so many more stories like this one waiting for you, so subscribe if you don't want to miss what comes next. Let's keep walking through these journeys together.